So, because why not, I decided to start doing rank videos on different artists' discographies. Sure, let's go ahead. Anyways, Radiohead. Radiohead are definitely one of the most critically acclaimed rock bands out there. They have made at least 3 records that people consider some of the best of their respective decades or even of all time. They appeared on multiple critics lists, they won 6 Grammy Awards, and even commercially speaking, they sold more than 30 million copies worldwide in a cumulative. And as generic as it may seem, they're also my favorite band. And stuff like them having 3 records on the radio music top 10 of all time, well, they deserve it. When I first started to dive deep into their discography, I immediately became obsessed with them. Their albums are not the most complex or experimental albums out there, but at the time, it wasn't like anything I've heard before. I always loved the different ideas that they put into their albums and the different genres they explore. Going through their discography was honestly an interesting experience. Okay, I'll stop beating around the bush. So I'm going to rank all of their 9 studio albums from worst to best, which obviously means no stuff like in Rainbow City 2. So hey, let's start. Paulo Honey is not a very good record. As I said before, Radiohead are known for being an excellent band, but the first album is pretty rough. There are 3 songs on this album that I liked, which being You, Blowout, and especially Creep, but most of the album is very generic and even forgettable. There are some songs that I think are even straight up bad. How Do You, I think, has a weird riff at the end. And the rest of the song is corny as fuck. Stop Whispering sucks, Thinking About You is boring, and the lyrics are about Tom York playing with himself. I can't even remember what some of the songs sounded like, examples being Ripcord or Vegetable. I don't think it's a terrible or even a bad album. For a 90s alternative rock album, is fine. And I can forgive this album since it was their first and they got them much better afterwards. But I will only recommend this one if you're a Radiohead completionist. Even if this record is next on my list, I think there's, at least in my opinion, a difference of quality between this album and Paulo Honey, even if I won't consider this album one of their best in any way. So The King of Limbs was aiming to be a rhythm and a looping center album, and I think for the most part it works, except for 2 or 3 tracks that I think are bottom tier Radiohead. I think the first 3 tracks of the album are solid, even if I didn't get them on my first listen, especially Bloom, which is one of my favorite songs of the album. Lotus Flower, I think it's the most tight and exciting song, and Separator is actually my top 15 or even top 10 favorite Radiohead songs. Separator is like a perfect sunrising song, I love it. But then there's songs like Feral, which feels like the band randomly experimenting with sounds without any direction, and Codex, which is just extremely boring and filler on an already short album. Speaking of which, The King of Limbs is also one of those records that I feel like it should have been longer than it was, and I guess Give Up the Ghost is a fine song. Hell to the Thief has an opposite problem to The King of Limbs. Whereas The King of Limbs felt like it should have been longer, Hell to the Thief was too long. And I don't have a problem with an album being long, it's just that there's some filler on Hell to the Thief that you could definitely cut off and have a more consistent album quality. That filler is, funnily enough, the song surrounding the best song of the album. Then there's a lot of good songs of the album, and there's a lot of different ideas presented here, but it's also probably the Radiohead record that flows naturally the least. That said, my favorite songs are 2 + 2 = 5, Sit Down Stand Up, Where I End and You Begin, and They're There. The last one I think is one of their best songs. It feels like a great climax song to the album. Like The King of Limbs is a good album, but I don't think it's one of their best. A Moonshaped Pool is their latest record, and certainly their most elegant. But in my opinion, I think it also has its subpar moments. The first 3 songs of the album I think are easily the best and top tier Radiohead for me. Burn the Witch is the least sad song of the album, yet it feels like a perfect open. The strings of the song are just so wonderful. Daydreaming is beautiful and haunting. It's like watching life passing without your presence. Dexter is my favorite song of the album, the piano melody is just perfect. But after the first 3 glorified songs, the album I think it starts to lose a bit of steam. I like all of the songs of the album, but some songs like The Numbers or Desert Island Disc feels a little flaccid. Thrill of Waits I think is a great closer though. It's crushing, it's depressing, it's a great note to end the album. The album is still number 6 because I think the following albums are more tight and complete. But this one is still a really good album worth checking out. The Bends has to be one of the greatest step-ups I ever seen from a band. The fact that you go from an average rock album to a much more tight album with a lot better songwriting and an album that feels like it's doing its own thing rather than feeling like a lot of records from that time, it's still mind-blowing to me. Is it a perfect album? No. There's still a bit of filler here, but I can definitely say that I really enjoyed this album. Planet Telex is a great opener that feels atmospheric and deliciously breezy. My dude, when Tom sings it's just so good. The title track is great and surprisingly underrated. High and Dry is also a very nice song, even if I think it's a bit overrated. Fake Plastic Dress is beautiful. Just, I think it's the most fun song of the album. My Iron Lung is great. And lastly, Street Spirit. This song is just fantastic. The riff that is present throughout the whole song is amazing, how the song builds up is fascinating, and it's certainly a unique track in the album. It's in my opinion their best closer, though there's one song that I think comes very close. There are some songs that I don't care all that much, like Bulletproof and Sulk though. I could do without those, but yeah, this album is great. We got to feel it. Amnesiac, I always thought that people were sleeping on it a little bit too much. The general reception of this album is that it's basically just a collection of Kid A B-sides, and honestly I think it's way more than that. To put it shortly, I think this album is the band's most underrated record. One of the things that I highly appreciate about this album is that even though Kid A and Amnesiac are both dark albums, Amnesiac I think has its own unique dark tone. I can really see any song from Amnesiac fit with any of Kid A's songs, and that's because Amnesiac is a more haunting, scarier and quiet album than Kid A is. Again, I think a lot of the songs of this album are great. Pyramid Song is just straight up beautiful. The little bit of quietness on how the song starts with Tom's vocals and how it beautifully builds up the strings. It's just an amazing song. I Might Be Wrong has a great haunting riff throughout the whole song and Tom's vocals are perfectly quiet. I like how conventional Knives Out is and the bass line behind it. Pack Like Sardines in a Crushed Steam Box, god that's a long name, it's one of the band's most underrated songs. I love the hollow percussion and the quite cool atmosphere the song presents. I like how like Spinning Plate sounds literally like a creepypasta song. And Life in a Glass House I think is a great jazzy closer to the album. The only song that I don't like from the album is Dollars and Cents, which is a song that I don't think brings anything new to the table. I don't think this is a perfect album, but it's certainly a very underrated one. Here it is, folks, the best album of all time. According to the folks of radio music, that is. OK Computer is what many people consider to be the band's best album. It was one of the most critically acclaimed albums of the 90s and one of the last real events of rock music. While the next record to follow was more of a transitional record for them, OK Computer was still a record where the band started to experiment a lot of things with the instrumentation and even the song structures. It was a record that was basically pretty much futuristic, that was dealing with themes that are still relevant to this day, like isolation, the feeling of existing instead of living, or anxiety. Paranoid Android is not only the best song of the album, but I definitely agree that is the best song they ever made, period. The guitars, Tom's vocals, the sections of the song that flow together naturally and perfectly, and even the kind of weird lyrics are great. And some other songs like Airbag, No Surprises, Exit Music, or the classic Karma Police are classics of the album as well. As you can tell though from the ranking of this album, I don't think this is their best album, and there are still a few problems I have with it. There are still some rather more underwhelming songs on the second half like The Tourist or Climbing Up the Walls, which I'm not too crazy about. Still, I think this is a really great album. The next and final two albums are not only the two best albums that Radiohead has ever did, but some of my favorite albums of all time. So, Kid A. After OK Computer, the band was burned out, tired, and didn't even know what to do for the next album. This led to the band making a huge departure from their more guitar-driven sound and bringing in more electronic and ambient influenced sounds for their next album. So from that came Kid A. So you know the rest of the story. People were divided when they first listened to it because it was so different from what they did before. Then it got a re-evaluation and it began to be known as one of the best albums of the decade. And I highly agree. Kid A is quite a unique experience. When I first listened to it, I didn't know what to think about it. It was unlike anything I've heard before, and it has some of the best songs the band has ever done. Everything in its right place. It's just one of the best album openers of all time, and perfectly lets you know what you're about to experience on Kid A from the first 4 notes of the song, and well, the rest of the song as well. And the rest of the album is also full of highlights. The national anthem, How to Disappear Completely, Idiotech, Morning Bell. Yes, I think Morning Bell is quite underrated. And my second favorite behind the opener, Motion Picture Soundtrack. This song is like witnessing the remaining minutes of your entire life. That haunting and beautiful organ is just incredible. Even some of the weaker songs of the album like the title track, Optimistic or In Limbo, I still really like and complement the album's experience. Kid A feels like an album where they reinvent themselves, and I do think it's one of the best albums of all time. But there's still one album that's even better. As magnificent and magical of an album Kid A was, In Rainbows, I think it's the best album they ever did, and a crowning achievement for them. I'm even going as far as to say it's my favorite album of all time. This album is just beautiful. It's not just a beautiful album, it's their most human, pure, and warming album. It's an album that represents truly something special for the band and for an experience. Every song of this album, I think it's a highlight. 15 Step is a great song, and I love how the song opens with this exciting drum sequence and then dives into these soft guitar riffs. I love the messy guitar from Body Snatchers and the pureness of the instrumentals and Tom's vocals on Youth. Weird Fishes is a perfect song. It's a roller coaster of warmth with relaxing piano chords and soft drum sequences, and the climax this song gets to, it's amazing. Tom's vocals also adds to the warmth of the song. I love how Tom's vocal performance and the deep haunting bass of All I Need. I like the little nice transitional song Faust rap. With Connor, I think it's the quintessential song that represents the magical beauty and pureness of the album. House Cars, while not one of my favorite songs of the album, has a nice peaceful atmosphere and a great guitar work here. Jigsaw falling into place, it's the most exciting song, packed with a great build-up and is essentially perfect climax to the album. And I love the simplicity of the piano and the quietness somberness it brings on videotape, the closer of the album. I love this album so much, and I think I've listened to it more than any album out there. It's just a perfect experience from start to finish that always brought me a sense of warmth whenever I heard it. It's just fantastic.